Okay, thank you so much, Tim, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Yeah, huge pleasure to be back. I think the last time I was here was before the pandemic, which feels like a million years ago. I just wanted to echo something that Tim just said and just sort of take a quick moment to pay tribute to Arthur Burns, who passed away last year. He was my PhD supervisor, and I owe a lot to his generosity. So I'll miss his presence today. Okay, so my paper is about a distinctive child and youth labour system that developed in many English rural counties from the end of the 17th century and continued right through to the 19th century. And it was a particular form of parish apprenticeship, or pauper apprenticeship. So parish or pauper apprenticeships were established by the Poor Laws of 1598 and 1601, which gave local parish officers the power to bind poor children of any age, usually between about 7 and 14, as apprentices by indenture, to another household to serve unpaid until the age of 21 for girls and 24 for boys. The most famous pauper apprentice is probably Oliver Twist. So if you know your Oliver Twist, he was bound as a pauper apprentice from the workhouse in about chapter 3. Something. Now, in practice, by the early 19th century, there were really sort of 3 types of parish apprenticeship, as identified by the Webbs in their classic study of 1927. So first, you got the binding of individual children to a master by agreement, who accepted to maintain the apprentice voluntarily with a small fee. Secondly, you got the binding of children in groups, in batches, to factories, especially from London to the northern textile industries, as studied by Katrina Honeyman in her book illustrated here. The third type was the systematic allocation of children among ratepayers, who were compelled to accept them. And it's the third type that is my focus today, as there's been almost no dedicated study on this in the last century since the Webbs. Now, it's distinctive for 2 main reasons. Firstly, it relied on the legal power of parishes to compel masters to take poor children as apprentices. It was always compulsory for the children and always compulsory for the parents. But for contemporaries, the controversial aspect was that parishioners could be forced to maintain a child as a servant in their household. Second thing that was distinctive was the way that it was administered in practice, usually in rotation around ratepayers, the local taxpayers in the parish, which made it a peculiar kind of system for organising labour. Since the ratepayers could not refuse, parishes could actually plan quite complex systems of distribution rather than making agreements on a case-by-case basis. So why is this type of apprenticeship historically significant? So firstly, it was notably criticised repeatedly in the 1830s by assistant poor law commissioners for being analogous to the labour rate or roundsman system, in the way that it forced parishioners to share the burden of employing the poor in proportion to the value of the property that they owned or rented. Now, this is significant because the labour rate was part of the so-called Speenhamland policies that attempted to deal with the crisis of rural poverty and unemployment from the 1790s and became the target of many of the criticisms of the old poor law. Now, like the policies for adults, these compulsory apprenticeship schemes were condemned at the time for being, quote, an undue interference with the market of free labour. Now, since the Speenhamland system has been long held as significant in the long-term history of the poor law and labour market, we should surely see these apprenticeship schemes as important too. But we know almost nothing about them, especially before the 19th century. There's another sort of interesting reason to pay close attention to them, and that is how, in practice, children were bound to parish land. So the legal implications of which sort of horrified John Meadows White, a parliamentary solicitor in 1829, when he pointed out a legal inconsistency. So the indentures, the contracts that bound children, placed an obligation on the person of the master, whereas children were in effect being bound to property. So you've got this, well, they're being bound to the person or to property. And White observed that in the latter case, quote, the fixing an apprentice upon an occupation would be a manifest retrogression to feudal slavery, and the children of the poor would at once become serfs and vassals. And this was a rhetorical flourish, but White was clearly correct to draw attention to the peculiar way that these schemes attached youth as long-term servants to work on local farms, which meant that parish apprenticeships had in some areas become, quote, a binding upon the soil. So in the following, I'll try to explain why these schemes emerged and how they worked. So my paper is sort of split into five parts. So first, I'll look at what we know already, both the blind spots, but also some of the hints that we've got in secondary literature. I'll then focus on the Southwest and the very early origins of these schemes in the late 17th century, before examining scale and their underlying policies. And I'll then use a case study from a parish in Devon to explore how these schemes were governed. And on this basis, try to characterize the political economy of compulsory apprenticeship schemes and draw out some implications. So, as I've indicated, the historiography on this third type of parish apprenticeship is negligible. And this can partly be explained by the fact that it was confined to certain regions. But I think it also sits in a kind of blind spot created by our standard interpretive frameworks. So most historiography on pauper apprenticeship has focused on their function as a device of poor relief, with the resulting labour contracts seen as a kind of byproduct. When attention does turn to the economics of apprenticeship, however, it's either focused on sort of household economy at the micro level or on the market economy at the kind of macro level. So either analysing individuals on a case-by-case basis or at the aggregate level in terms of wider statistical patterns. So for example, Steve Hindle's very brilliant foundational study of pauper apprenticeships in the 17th century jumps between the micro and the macro levels. Pamela Sharp's excellent study of the parish of Collerton in Devon analyses the economics of apprenticeship almost entirely in terms of the dynamics of the local labour market and the demographics of family life. But when analysed in terms of market dynamics of supply and demand, the movement of child apprentices can only really be understood as either a direct response to the demand for labour or as a kind of interference in the labour market, for example, by overstocking unskilled trades. But this framework, I think, is a mistake, as their labour had no price and they were not bought and sold as a commodity. But most importantly, this neglects the organisational role of the parish, kind of this middle level here. So my aim is to try to contribute to the political economy of parish apprenticeships by exploring it as a system of labour shaped by legal and political institutions, primarily the parish. Now, as I've said, we currently know very little about these compulsory schemes, but we do have two kinds of evidence to help us get started. So first, from the Poor Laws of the Poor Law Report, of 1834, which was used by the Webbs to sketch a kind of broad geographical snapshot. And they noted on the basis of this evidence a rough kind of geographical split between the rural counties of Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Suffolk, Norfolk, and Yorkshire that forcibly allocated children among ratepayers, whereas counties such as Sussex, Surrey, Kent, and Berkshire kept children in the workhouse. However, they neglected a few other reports from 1834 that show that compulsory apprenticeships were more widespread, particularly in the West Midland counties of Herefordshire and Shropshire. Secondly, before the 1830s, we only have occasional hints scattered across various studies. And I do mean hints. Often this is a sentence, half a sentence that I have picked up and collated. But nonetheless, I found a range of references to rotation or lottery schemes or compulsory binding of some form in the counties listed here, notably from as early as the 1660s. And this map collates this evidence in a very rough manner. So I've highlighted whole counties here, but sometimes this reflects evidence from maybe just a single parish. So it's not meant to be precise, but I've gathered all these hints and thrown them in a map. But it's notable there's already a kind of a broad, regional split consistent with maybe a basic socioeconomic division between a highland pastoral zone in the north and west and a lowland arable zone in the south and east of England, with the notable exception of the eastern counties of Norfolk and Suffolk. But they represent kind of a special case, as these schemes were administered by the incorporated hundreds established from the 1750s onwards by local acts of parliament. This actually supports my general conclusion later, which is that what matters here is often local governance structure, not just the underlying socioeconomic conditions. In any case, there's two basic points I want you to take from this quick survey. One, the southwest emerged as kind of the main hotbed of these compulsory schemes, so that constitutes the focus of my study. But two, I do want you to keep in mind that although the southwest was not typical, this is not a national story, it was not an anomaly either. So what I'm going to talk about has resonance outside the southwest. Okay, so first I want to establish the early origins in the southwest. So I surveyed surviving parish records in Devon, Somerset, and Dorset, and found evidence of 40 parishes operating compulsory apprenticeship schemes, or what I'll call property binding schemes, before 1750. So this table shows the dates for the earliest evidence for these schemes in the parishes named. This is a summary. In almost all these cases where I've checked, the parishes tended to be binding children almost exclusively to farm service, so husbandry or housewifery. And they all seem to be operating a rotation scheme of some sort in which children were allocated in turn to farms around the parish and then going round again. But it's worth noting that some of these records were retrospective. So the record was compiled at a later date and backdated, and the evidence is not all equally weighted. In some cases, this represents the beginning of a very continuous, clear series of evidence, and in others, it's the first of a few patchy pieces of evidence. So the precise dates can be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt, but the general chronology of the evidence, I think, is fairly clear, and this maybe shows it in an easier manner. So this shows the number of parishes with the earliest evidence that I found in each decade. So we can see clearly that property binding schemes began before the end of the 17th century and were widely established in the southwest by the mid-18th century, with many parishes keeping systematic records by this point. Now, the timing is very significant. This is long before the main evidence that we previously had from the 1830s reports. This is long before the mass binding of children to textile factories, which is a phenomenon from really 1780s onwards. This is long before the implementation of labour allocation schemes of the Speenhamland-era. So the chronology is significant. So why do these schemes appear at this time? So first, we can consider main economic and political context. So we have the rising cost of poor relief at the end of the 17th century, which created anxiety among ratepayers and policymakers and motivated various pamphleteers to propose solutions focused on setting the poor to work. We have the general economic crisis of the 1690s through a combination of war, inflation, and monetary instability. See Brodie Waddell's two recent articles on both these points. Three, we have the failure of national structural reform in response to this crisis, with 14 bills from 1695 to 1714 that attempted unsuccessfully to overhaul the Elizabethan poor laws. But in the face of that, we have the greater success of local initiatives, especially the founding of workhouses in towns and cities from 1698. See the thesis by Hitchcock, T. And we have the relative labour shortage at the end of the 17th century, prompting renewed efforts to push youth into employment, both through the enforcement of compulsory service and parish apprenticeships. Second, a legal context. So the legality of compelling someone to be a master to a pauper apprentice was only clarified in statute in 1697 with a £10 fine for refusal, almost a century after the original legislation. Yet the statute was strangely silent on the subject of who could be compelled to take an apprentice. And it was only settled in case law at the King's Bench in 1789 that the compulsory power applied to occupiers of lands within the parish, both resident and non-resident. But it appears that this was largely being implemented in this way in practice before 1789. So those liable to pay for poor relief on the basis of owning or renting land were also liable to take on poor children as apprentices. So what we see then in this period in the late 17th, early 18th century is overlapping pressures to find new solutions to poverty, the enhancement of statutory powers to force poor youth into apprenticeship, and local experiments in setting the poor to work. And this is the context in which rural parishes began developing new schemes for distributing poor children. Significantly, however, some schemes began before getting this statutory confirmation of the power to compel masters in 1697. So, as we find in many cases with the poor law, policy preceded the law. So here's the first example. This is a register of apprentices from Halberton, beginning in 1684, and it was headed "An account of apprentices bound out yearly by the parish, and to whom and for what estates." So estates here, we don't have, there's no grand country estates, but there's just land holding in the parish. So we have halfway down there, Mr. to Mr. Rich for his estate, and then near the bottom to Francis Everley for David Hill's estate, and so on. So each entry names the master and the estate in respect of which the child was bound, with less attention to the child, actually. And in a lot of the registers, they don't even bother to name the child. They're interested in what estate the child was bound to at what date. But in an example of a parish responding seemingly directly to the 1697 statute is Drayton in Somerset. So this register was titled "An account of the apprentices that has been bound out since the new Act of Parliament that empowered them to do the same, which commenced the 1st of May 1697. So we seem to have a parish responding quite directly here. And otherwise, there was a noticeable flurry of activity in the years immediately following the passage of the Act. So Nettlecombe in Somerset, you can't see that register particularly well, but it began a very organized system in 1698, as recorded in this register. So the scheme, calls itself a scheme at the top, was represented in this very sort of extensive table with a specific column for the respective estates, which I found noted for. Now, in general, the records show that the schemes evolved gradually and became more organizationally complex over time. So in most cases, there was no sharp beginning to these schemes. Instead, recording the master's estate grew slowly in importance to keep track of which estates had recently taken an apprentice. The actual order of rotation seems to have typically emerged through customary practices and was formalized retrospectively, i.e., children were bound to farmers in turn, in perhaps a fairly informal manner to begin with, but then fairness required that the same or a similar order was followed the next time, prompting the need for better recording. In the parish of Ken in Devon, a neat register in a slim volume was helpfully titled "A rotation for binding out parish apprentices in Ken, formed from inspecting the counterparts of the indentures, the Book of Orders and the Poor Books since the year 1716. So we have someone looking through old records, figuring out what the order of rotations should be. So it's compiled in the 1780s, I think, with entries running from 1720 onwards. Okay, so now let me tell you a little bit more about these schemes. So firstly, to give you a sense of scale, here is a sample of 16 schemes from which I could extract reliable numbers for the average number of bindings per year, ranging from less than 1 to over 12, mostly somewhere in the region of 1 to 9, or overall on average just over 3. So a huge range, and clearly a flexible system that could function at different scales in small or large parishes. And most schemes involved around 40 to 100 estates per rotation, with a couple of outliers. Again, considerable variation, but it's clear that the number of households involved meant that these were relatively complex schemes, right, that needed a certain amount of administration. Okay, so how exactly did they operate? So the basic template for Southwest schemes was a simple rotation, one apprentice bound per estate until all estates had participated, and then beginning again. However, many parishes incorporated a proportional element into the scheme, either by creating a scale to apportion apprentices to the size of the estate, or by grouping or dividing estates into equal units and then binding apprentices per unit. So the earliest sort of formal policy of this kind, which established quite a complex proportional system, is found in West Buckland from Somerset from 1701. And in June of that year, the vestry decided to bind poor children to two parishioners, quote, by an equal pound rate, i.e. the same basis on which they were taxed for poor relief. And the vestry divided parish land into units assessed at £15 per annum, each of which should take an apprentice. And then a detailed table spread over 2 pages grouped estates to make multiples of £15, with one apprentice allotted to each class of £15, 2 apprentices allotted to classes of £30, and so on. So third sort of grouping, third row down from the bottom there, you've got 3 estates that are joined to make £46 per annum. They would have 3 apprentices. And then below that, you've got 7 smaller estates joined to make £15 per annum to take just 1 apprentice. The classes range from 1 to 7 estates, with a total of 106 estates grouped together into 29 classes to take 43 apprentices per rotation. Hope everyone's still with me. A century later, Burnham-on-Sea, also in Somerset, aimed to increase the precision of their scheme by binding children precisely by the acre, which is where I get my title from. So the parish calculated that over the previous 32 years, 75 apprentices had been bound across 4,000 acres, calculating the ratio of 1 apprentice per 53 acres, or every £133 per property. Based on this, they developed a new proportional system. So whereas the old method, which is sort of detailed on the right-hand column, the old method had allocated children to small and large estates ranging from £30 to £600 on the same basis. The new method was designed to ensure that children were bound to units of between £100 and £150 per annum, or around 50 acres. And a detailed table followed this, classifying all parish land above £10 annual value into 75 units, showing a precise breakdown of the ratio of apprentice per acre. So it gives you a little bit of an introduction overview to your scheme. So now I want to dig a little bit deeper by looking at this case study of Orliscombe in Devon. So Orliscombe was a medium-sized, is a medium-sized parish in East Devon. Here it is. A predominantly pastoral farming community, and in the early 18th century, it had a population of around 400. So a few headline figures about this parish first. So a total of 158 children were bound between 1669 and 1749. This was an average of almost 2 children per year overall, but 3 children per year in the 18th century. So the frequency increased. Based on the baptism records, I estimate that this was around 1/4 of all children born in Orliston. So a very significant minority. The gender ratio was almost exactly 1-to-1. Same number of girls and boys were bound. The average age children were bound was under 9 years old, many of whom were 7. And I think every single one, without exception, was bound to housewifery, or husbandry, i.e. farm service. So a register, shown here, again, maybe not the clearest, formally recorded these bindings from 1708, although it was likely compiled around 1740. And it showed that children were bound according to an organised rota system. So the register not only stated the name of the child and the name of the master, but the name of an estate, the farm essentially, the tax rate that estate paid to the poor, the year when the apprenticeship was due to expire, and the year when the estate was then filled up again with another apprentice. So they're keeping track of this rotation. Now, by reconstructing this with some other records, it becomes clear that the basic scheme was pretty simple. So between 1708 and 1741, when there was a small policy change, apprentices were bound in rotation to the current occupier of each property assessed at or above 2d, equivalent to a rent of about £10 a year. One apprentice was bound to one estate regardless of its size. Okay, so what did this distribution look like in practice? So between 1708 and 1746, the apprenticeship scheme went through 2 full rotations, with some exceptions. And this chart on the right-hand side displays a timeline of bindings at different estates from 1708 to 1750. So it's quite small, difficult to read, but I've listed the names of the estates on the left-hand side. And then the years are listed along the top, from 1708 to 1750. And for each estate, the sort of grey bar covers the year the term of the apprenticeship begins to the term when the apprenticeship was due to expire. So the period blocked out shows when the estate would have hosted an apprentice if they had served their full term. Where I have information that they did not serve their full term, I've shortened the grey bars. There's a few short ones there where apprenticeship ended early. The 2 rotations can be seen relatively clearly. I put a dotted line down 1727 to indicate the start of the new rotation. Although it's worth noting that the second rotation did not precisely follow the order of the first one, although there's rough correspondence. So the key characteristics of this scheme then, 1, this is absolutely integral to the local economy, involving most households in the parish, either the pauper household or the master household. It was well organised, it was stable over decades, providing a degree of predictability. The primary criteria for selecting the master must have been their position as an occupier of an estate due in the rotation, and other factors must have been secondary, otherwise the rotation simply wouldn't have worked. And overall, it seems the main goal of the scheme was to distribute poor children evenly among them, the majority of the ratepayers. So we've looked at how the scheme worked, but who organised and participated in this scheme? Now, in most studies, the overall organisational picture looks a bit like this. So we usually have sort of 3 groups which are treated separately. So we've got the parish officers, the 2 church wardens and 2 overseers of the poor, who were empowered to bind children. They were empowered to bind children to the masters on a case-by-case basis, whether inside or outside the parish, And this system is funded by the ratepayers, which maybe pays a small premium to some masters, but maybe more importantly, satisfies their desire to keep the rates low. The analysis then proceeds on the basis that parish officers and masters are entirely separate groups, like two different sets of actors with different motivations. But in a rural parish like Orliscombe, running a rotation scheme, the degree of overlap and interchange is so considerable that we need to revise this picture. And this is because, like many parishes, Orliscombe also selected its overseers and church wardens according to a fixed rota based on an almost identical list of estates. So in other words, being a master to an apprentice was effectively like serving another parish office. I mean, practically it was almost equivalent, which means it was a political role. I think it's important to think of it as a political role, with a couple of key differences. Women were effectively excluded from office holding, or at least in this parish, but they could act as a master or a mistress to an apprentice. And obviously the term of service as a master was many continuous years, not 1 year. So to be a little bit more specific about these masters, I've identified a total of 115 distinct masters from 1669 to 1749. 10 of whom were women, mostly widows. The majority are only recorded as a master once, but about a quarter of all masters received 2 apprentices or more. So how many of these masters also served as parish officers? So from 1704 to 1749, out of a possible 184 officer roles, a remarkable 91% were filled by men who were also named as a master to an apprentice at some point. Therefore, most serving parish officers making decisions about binding apprentices would themselves have experience of being a master. From the reverse perspective, roughly 60% of masters also served as a parish officer. So the records confirm that it was the norm for each farmer to serve as both a parish officer and as a master to a poor apprentice. But we need to add another layer to this picture, because the evidence shows that key decisions about the scheme were made at meetings of the parish vestry, which was the central governing body of parish affairs. So we can also look at the overlap between masters and vestry members, or vestrymen. So using the signatures on annual accounts as a proxy measure, I can do this for the period 1728 to 1749. So cross-referencing the names of masters, parish officers, and vestry members for each year gives me this chart, which needs a little bit of explanation. So it shows 52 men and women. I can't fit the individual names on the left because it's too small. 52 men and women who are recorded in these years either as attending vestry meetings, shown in red, serving as a church warden or overseer in yellow, or third, acting as a master to a parish apprentice in the sort of greeny blue. And the number of times I count them in each role. So note that this is not, entirely comprehensive or precise, as it doesn't capture roles filled before or after this sample period. But nonetheless, I think that the pattern is indicative of the structure of the scheme. So we can roughly divide this, I think, into maybe 3 groups. So at the bottom, we've got the men who dominated the vestry. In the middle, we've got those who are mostly officers, maybe occasional vestry members. And at the top, we've got those who were only ever masters to apprentices, which I have then represented in this chart. So we essentially have a single body of ratepayers who were involved in the scheme to different degrees, allocating children to each other according to a system designed by the governing court. So while there's no sharp divisions, we have a clear kind of spectrum of power here. So at the very core, a small bluish circle, we have, the parish oligarchy, the chief inhabitants, the most prosperous yeomen and tenant farmers, who were the highest resident ratepayers. Let's call them the governors of the scheme. They were the main policy makers, decision makers, and most likely to take apprentices themselves. That was approximately 8 to 10 householders at one time. The second group consists of those who were active in the scheme, primarily as serving as officers binding children, as well as masters taking them, but who were maybe not regular vestry members. So let's call these the administrators, the middling ratepayers, that's about 20 householders. And at the periphery, we have the passive participants of the scheme, perhaps those who filled roles as masters, but who never served as parish officers nor as vestry members, hence exerted less influence, about another 15 householders. What I want to stress is that in this organizational model, there is no meaningful distinction between the state and employers. No distinction between the political and the economic realm. Instead, we have a collectively managed scheme that was no doubt dominated by a governing elite, but whose administration and participation was relatively widespread. Okay, so in the final section, I want to reflect a little bit more generally on what I'll call the political economy of these apprenticeship schemes. So first we can ask, what kind of labour system was this? Because it's a bit odd. So historians sometimes view them as a kind of inferior craft apprenticeship, but this doesn't really capture the role of legal coercion and the centralising planning role of the parish. Secondly, since many children were orphans and bound very young, as young as 7, it's sometimes been seen as almost an extension of a boarding out system, kind of fostering service. But this doesn't really capture the fact that children were bound by indenture for long periods and were expected to work. So what about the analogy with serfdom made by John Meadows White that I quoted earlier? There are some parallels, including the use of coercion, the effective legal right of parishioners to access the unpaid service of local pauper children, and the apportioning of child workers to local land. But the conditions are otherwise so different, and these schemes are limited to children under temporary contract, so that analogy, I think, goes a bit too far, so that doesn't quite work either. So the closest approximation is life cycle service, in which young people would work on farms primarily for food and lodging, which itself was subject to a degree of coercion under the labour laws. Although service was largely voluntary, paid and limited to a year, or even less, so still very different. But if we think of it as a system of labour, then the apprentice schemes approximate a kind of extreme formalisation of service. Particularly how it operates in polarized communities, in which servants are not exchanged between roughly equal households, but tend to move in one direction from poorer to wealthier households, constituting a kind of net transfer of labour capacity. So in the case of apprenticeship, this transfer of labour capacity was not driven by economic pressures directly, but the parish using statutory powers, statutory law to intervene and reconstitute households when children were too young to hire themselves out as servants. So the parish intervenes earlier. As they wouldn't hire themselves as servants until maybe around 15 years of age. But this creates a very different kind of workforce to servants, who could move between farmers on a yearly basis and seek the best pay and conditions. In contrast, these pauper apprentices were far less flexible, far less free. Second big question, what was kind of wider social function of these compulsory apprenticeship schemes? So later commentators were fairly clear that the principal merit of this system was not the short-term supply of labour, but the long-term production of a superior class of labourers, as indicated by these quotes. So for example, in 1796, the agricultural writer William Marshall thought farm apprentices in Devon were poorly treated, but argued that with a good master, quote, a more natural seminary of working husbandmen could not be devised. And by the 1840s, it was a highly divisive policy, but supporters believed that it was, to quote one local Devon gentleman, the very best mode of bringing up a robust, honest, and industrious peasantry. Hence, I think we should take these hints and see the function of these schemes not simply as an immediate response to family poverty, not simply an immediate response to employer demand, but also as a strategy for reproducing the desired labouring class. And this makes sense when we consider how the scheme was organised. It must have served the collective interests of the chief inhabitants who dominated the vestry and office holding, balanced to some extent by smaller landholders, who were simultaneously acting in their interests as employers, taxpayers, and poor law administrators. They're wearing all three hats at once. The principal actors were yeomen or tenant farmers, large tenant farmers, who could effectively choose how to manage poor families by either maintaining them or employing them. And effectively, the parish took collective responsibility for raising a class of industrious adult labourers, carefully distributing the burden of maintaining them, putting them to work, and instilling moral discipline. Third, and sort of finally, where do compulsory apprenticeship schemes fit within broader narratives of economic change? Now, the long 18th century is conventionally understood as a period of an expanding market economy and an increase in free wage labour. But here we find the intensification of unfree labour and non-market institutions for organising labour. Now, the simplest explanation is to point to regional variation. So perhaps this story just fits with existing narratives in which the rise of capitalist farming is based on free hired labour, was really only applies to the south and east of England in this period, whereas in the north and west of England, small family farming and service continued into the 19th century. But I think we could look at this in another way. A growing literature rejects the assumption that forms of unfree labour, particularly slavery, is incompatible with a market or capitalist economy. In fact, rather than an obstacle, scholars have pointed to numerous ways in which coercive labour laws were used to create and shape labour markets. And if we focus on the outcome of these schemes, rather than just their inherent characteristics, then they appear to be maybe rather effective engines of proletarianization. If you take significant numbers of young children and place them into unpaid service until adulthood, then these people are not going to go on to set up independent households and become small farmers. They will have little option at the end of their term other than to hire themselves out as servants or labourers and join the ranks of landless wage workers. So to conclude, so let's summarise. So from the end of the 18th century, parishes in the southwest of England, later followed by other rural areas, began using their powers under the Poor Law to operate as centrally planned economies, coordinating the precise distribution of a group of servants by compelling pauper children and ratepayers to enter labour contracts according to an agreed policy. So what is most significant here? So first, the early origins places this in a very different historical context than previously. It means that the policy of binding children to landholders developed along with the new workhouse movement from the 1690s, and it may be fruitful to think about how these strategies kind of dovetailed in rural and urban areas. It also means that the use of coercive powers to systematically organise child labour was not an innovation of industrialisation, but had been implemented in the countryside for almost a century. It also means that the experiments in allocating pauper labour to ratepayers began decades before the famous Speenhamland-era. Second, The Southwest was not unique, but these schemes only seem to have really developed in certain areas, so we can think about why. One general hypothesis would be that the prevalence of these schemes in the west and north of England suggests that they thrived in pastoral areas reliant on family labour and life cycle service. So in these areas, large farmers preferred to use their poor law powers to create a stable labour force beneficial to them, but with the cost spread among ratepayers. In contrast, in arable south and east, with a plentiful supply of casual wage labour hired by the day, larger farmers had little desire to create a class of living servants on long-term contracts. Instead, they preferred to place children in workhouses and regulate short-term employment of adult paupers to maintain a flexible force through Speenhamland-style policies. Third, in the areas they did develop, these were really significant local institutions involving or impacting most of the local community, with parishes like Alscombe binding around one portable parish-born children. Fourth, I hope that I have demonstrated that we can't analyse the distribution of apprentices in terms of market dynamics. We need to adopt the perspective of political economy and think of the schemes as a fully rounded social policy designed to maintain and reproduce the social order. Finally, as I've indicated, I think these schemes raise some fresh questions about the relationship between the poor law and the rural labour market, which I don't really have the full answer to, and I think requires further research, but which I think is perhaps best seen in terms of the way that the poor laws could help to construct rather than simply obstruct labour markets. And I will end there. Thank you very much.